My name is Walter, and for 37 years my office was a 1,000-acre section of rich, dark earth under an open sky. I was the chief agronomist for Abernathy Farms, a sprawling 50,000-acre operation that my family had helped build from the ground up, though our name was never on the sign. My official title was a stuffy, corporate-sounding thing, but what I really was the farm's memory. I knew the land, not as a grid of GPS coordinates, but as a living thing. I knew its moods, its history, its secrets. I knew which fields would flood in a heavy spring rain, and which would bake to a concrete crust in a dry August. I knew this because my father had taught me, and his father had taught him. We weren't just employees, we were stewards. And our family's greatest secret, the heart of the entire operation, wasn't on any company balance sheet. It was a strain of seed, a genetically unique drought and blight-resistant miracle that my grandfather had first started developing almost a century ago. We called it the heirloom. It was perfectly, exquisitely adapted to the fickle, often brutal conditions of our region, and it was mine. Then the private equity vultures came. Blackwood Equity Partners. They swooped in with their leveraged buyout, their talk of synergy and optimization. The Abernathy family, tired and with no heirs willing to take over, sold. They cashed out and disappeared to warmer climates, and a new man arrived in a ridiculously clean, brand-new pickup truck that had never seen a gravel road. His name was Julian. He had a sharp suit, an MBA from a school I couldn't pronounce, and the kind of dead-eyed smile you see on sharks. He walked into my office, which smelled of soil and rain, and wrinkled his nose. He didn't look at the yield charts on my wall, the product of decades of meticulous record-keeping. He didn't look at the soil maps I'd colored by hand. He looked at me, at my worn boots, and my weathered face, and saw a relic. The meeting was short, clinical. He sat behind a new sterile white desk in the main office, a desk that replaced the old oak one Mr. Abernathy had used for 50 years. Julian didn't offer me a seat. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen on a tablet. He said they were grateful for my years of service. That was the first lie. He said they were pivoting to a new paradigm. That was the first piece of meaningless jargon. Then he delivered the line that lit the fuse. He said, "Walter, we're moving toward a fully data-driven agricultural model. We need a team that's fluent in the new language of farming. Your intuition, while admirable, is no longer a required asset." My intuition. He said it like I was some old mystic reading goat entrails in a barn. My intuition was the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations, of thousands of seasons, of watching, listening, and learning from the land itself. It was the knowledge that our soil had a high concentration of bentonite clay, a foot below the topsoil, a dense, unforgiving layer that standard commercial seed roots couldn't penetrate, causing them to fail mid-season. My intuition was the reason Abernathy Farms had posted record profits during the last 3 regional droughts, while neighboring farms went bankrupt. But to Julian, it was just an analog liability in his new digital world. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I'd seen his type before. Arguing with a man like Julian is like trying to explain the color blue to a man born blind. He can learn the word, but he will never understand the sky. So I just nodded. I said, "I understand." My calmness seemed to unnerve him. He was expecting a fight, a pathetic plea from an old man for his job. He was prepared for emotion. He was completely unprepared for quiet dignity. He gestured to the door. A young man in a cheap suit, an HR representative, was waiting with a cardboard box. They had already cleaned out my office. 37 years of my life, packed into a box. My family photos, a few old books, A mug my daughter painted for me. They had left, I noticed, the framed awards for agricultural innovation and record yields. They didn't see those as mine. I suppose they saw them as company property. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about a great many things. And as I walked out of that office, for the last time, past the faces of men and women I had hired, trained and worked alongside for decades, a cold, hard clarity settled over me. Julian and his team of data jockeys had their advanced GPS tractors, their high-resolution drone imaging, their algorithms, and their spreadsheets. They had the 50,000 acres of land. They even had the silos, filled to the brim with what they thought were the seeds for next season's crop. What they didn't have, what they didn't even know existed as a separate entity, was the heirloom stock. Because for 3 generations, my family had never stored our proprietary seeds on company property. They were safe, housed in a private, climate-controlled seed bank my father had built in an old, unmarked barn on my own land, miles away. The seeds they had in their silos were standard, off-the-shelf commercial-grade seeds, a fine product for the right soil. For our soil they were poison. They would sprout, they would grow for a few weeks, and then they would die. And by the time their precious data told them what was happening, it would be far, far too late. Julian thought he was firing an old man. What he had actually done was fire the only thing keeping his multi-million-dollar investment from turning into 50,000 acres of dirt. If you've ever been made to feel obsolete by someone who wouldn't know a ripe crop from a spreadsheet, then you know exactly how I felt in that moment. Stick around, because this is the story of how they learned that you can't download a lifetime of experience. Let me know in the comments if you've ever dealt with a Julian in your own life. And please, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. They thought they were buying a farm. They were about to find out they'd only bought the land and forgotten to purchase the soul. The drive home was the longest 15 miles of my life. I didn't turn on the radio. I just listened to the hum of the tires on the asphalt, the sound of a life being severed from its foundation. Each familiar landmark, the old oak tree struck by lightning in '98, the creek that always ran high in April, felt like a ghost from a past that was no longer mine. I felt erased. 37 years of getting up before the sun, of walking the fields until my bones ached, of worrying over frost and praying for rain. All of it dismissed in a 5-minute meeting by a man who probably thought soil came in a bag from a garden center. The sheer callous indifference of it was what stung the most. It wasn't personal for him. It was a line item. I was an inefficiency to be streamlined, an old piece of software being deleted. I bypassed the turn to my house and kept driving, my truck moving on autopilot. I ended up on a dusty track leading to the back of my property, stopping in front of a weathered, anonymous-looking barn that most people would have assumed was full of forgotten junk. But inside, it was anything but. I unlocked the heavy, insulated door and stepped from the warm afternoon into the cool, dry air. The gentle hum of the climate control system was the only sound. It was my sanctuary, my fortress. The ark lining the walls were not tools, but meticulously organized, hermetically sealed containers, racks upon racks of them, each one labeled with a code, a generation, a substrain, a date. This was my family's legacy. This was the heirloom. I ran my hand over a steel container marked G3 Delta 7, the 7th refinement of the 3rd generation, the one with enhanced resistance to fusarium wilt. I remembered the year my father perfected it. He'd come into the kitchen, his hands stained with dirt and chlorophyll, and he'd been smiling a smile so wide it made his eyes water. He'd held up a single, perfect stalk of wheat and said, "We did it, Walt. We beat the wilt." It wasn't about money.
It was about solving the puzzle. It was about survival. It was about creating something that would last. I opened one of the master containers. The seeds inside were small, a slightly deeper shade of amber than the commercial varieties. They looked unremarkable, but I knew what they held. The genetic memory of 100 years of struggle and triumph. I scooped up a handful, the tiny hard kernels feeling cool against my palm. This was real. This was tangible. Julian and his team had their data clouds and their algorithms, their ethereal streams of ones and zeros. I had this, something I could hold, something that held the future of that farm in its tiny dormant form. The weight of the betrayal, which had been a cold knot in my stomach, finally broke. I leaned against a rack, the seeds clutched in my fist, and for the first time since I was a boy, I felt the hot sting of tears. They weren't tears of sadness. Not really. They were tears of rage. A cold, quiet, profound rage. How dare they? How dare they come in and try to strip mine a legacy? They didn't even have the sense to understand. My mind drifted back. Flashbacks, not of trauma, but of context. I saw my grandfather, a stooped, powerful man, with hands like worn leather, kneeling in the dirt. He wasn't much for talking, but when he spoke about the land, it was like listening to a poet. He'd crumble a bit of soil in his fingers, smell it, and say, "Too much alkali here, Walter. The corn will yellow. We need to work in more peat." He didn't have a soil sensor. He had a connection. He taught me to read the land, not as a static resource, but as a partner in a difficult, lifelong dance. He was the one who started it all, crossing hardy wild grasses with early wheat strains, looking for something that could survive the Dust Bowl years. Then my father, a different kind of man, a high school science teacher who saw the farm as his laboratory. He built the first version of the seed bank in our cellar, using old refrigerators and dehumidifiers. He was the one who truly refined the genetics, spending his evenings bent over a microscope, painstakingly cross-pollinating with tweezers, keeping meticulous notes in ledger books. He was the one who approached old Mr. Abernethy, the original owner. Theirs was a friendship forged in shared hardship, a bond built over a collapsed fence line during a blizzard. The deal was a handshake, a true gentleman's agreement. My family provides the seed. You provide the land. My father had said, we grow together. It was a partnership. No lawyers, no contracts. It was a time when a man's word and his reputation were worth more than any piece of paper. Looking back now, it seems criminally naive, a massive glaring vulnerability. But that's the thing about honor. It makes you vulnerable to people who have none. Competence doesn't always protect you from malice. That was a lesson I was learning far too late. I carried on the work. I was the bridge between the old ways and the new. I was the one who saw the potential in GPS technology, not to replace our knowledge, but to enhance it. I convinced a skeptical Mr. Abernethy to invest in the first generation of variable rate applicators. But I didn't just upload a satellite map. I walked every single one of the thousands of acres, taking soil samples and created my own custom prescription maps. We applied nitrogen where it was needed, not in a uniform blanket. We saved a fortune in fertilizer and our yields skyrocketed. The data was my servant, not my servant, not my rooted. The data was my servant, not my master. I used technology to express my understanding of the land more precisely. Julian saw my worn boots and assumed I was a Luddite. He never bothered to ask who had designed the very nutrient system his team was now inheriting. I finally locked up the barn and drove home. The sun was setting, painting the sky sky in angry strokes of orange and purple. My wife Eleanor met me at the door. She saw the box in my hand and the look on my face, and she saw the box in my hand and the look on my face, and she knew. She didn't say a word, just wrapped her arms around me. Her embrace was the only thing that felt solid in a world that had turned to quicksand. Later that evening, after I'd explained the cold corporate brutality of it, she asked the question that was hanging in the air. What about the severance, Walter? The pension? I told her the truth. The severance package was an insult. Barely 3 months' pay for 37 years of service. And my pension, the buyout, had triggered a clause. The old pension plan was being terminated and rolled into a 401k, and because of some legal loophole Blackwood's lawyers had exploited, I was 2 months shy of being fully vested in the new plan. They'd done it deliberately. They'd timed it perfectly to save themselves a few $100,000. The new plan. They'd done it deliberately. They'd timed it perfectly to save themselves a few $100,000. It was a level of calculated cruelty that was almost artistic in its perfection. The phone rang late that night. It was my father. He was in his late 80s now, living in a small retirement community an hour away. His mind was still sharp as a tack, but his body was failing him. I told him what happened. I expected him to be angry, to yell. Instead, there was a long silence on the line. I could hear the faint sound of the television in his room. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but firm as bedrock. The land remembers, Walter, and so do the seeds. They are ours. They have always been ours. Let them have the dirt. We have the life. His words were like a splash of cold water. He was right. My anger began to cool, to harden, to transform from a hot, useless rage into something cold, clear, and sharp. This wasn't just about my job anymore. It wasn't about revenge. It was about legacy. It was about protecting my family's life's work from a group of financial strip miners who saw at night. From a group of financial strip miners who saw a century of agricultural artistry as nothing more than an asset to be liquidated.
The next morning, driven by a new sense of purpose, I went online. I started researching Blackwood Equity Partners. It didn't take long to find their pattern. They were locusts in suits. They'd buy a stable, family-owned manufacturing plant, fire the experienced managers, load the company with debt to pay for their own acquisition, and then sell off the pieces before the whole thing collapsed. They'd done it in textiles, in regional shipping, in tool and die manufacturing. Everywhere they went, they left a hollowed-out husk and a trail of broken lives. A quote from their CEO in a business journal stood out to me. We unlock value by shedding legacy costs and monetizing underutilized assets. I was a legacy cost, and they were about to discover what my underutilized asset truly was. Any lingering shred of guilt I might have felt, any thought of offering them a warning, evaporated. They didn't deserve a warning. They deserved the harvest they were about to sow. My resolve was no longer just emotional. It was strategic. They had started a war without understanding their enemy's weapons. The first step in any quiet war is to understand your arsenal. My arsenal wasn't just the seeds themselves, but the lifetime of knowledge that went with them. My secret weapon wasn't just a thing, it was a process. The heirloom seeds weren't just generically drought-resistant. Over decades, my father and I had subtly guided their evolution, selecting for traits that made them uniquely suited to the 50,000 acres of Abernathy farms and nowhere else. Our land was a patchwork quilt of soil types. The northeast quadrant was sandy loam, quick to drain and lose nutrients. The southern fields were heavy, alkaline clay, and running through the middle was a band of black earth, so rich it was almost greasy. A single one-size-fits-all seed couldn't possibly thrive across such a diverse landscape. So we didn't have one heirloom seed. We had a dozen substrains. The G3 Alpha 2 for the sandy soil, with a deep taproot system to seek out moisture. The B5 Epsilon 9 for the clay, bred to tolerate high pH, and with a fibrous root network that could break through the compacted subsoil. Each year, I would walk the fields and create a custom blend for each quadrant, sometimes down to the individual acre. It was a complex symphony of genetics, and I was the only conductor. The company seeds Julian's team had in their silos were a standard commercial hybrid, a good one, a reliable workhorse in the right conditions. But on our land, the plants in the sandy loam would sprout fast and then starve for lack of water and nitrogen. The plants in the clay would germinate, grow to be about 6 inches tall, and then their roots would hit that dense concrete-like bentonite layer and just stop. They'd turn yellow, wither, and die, and from a satellite image, it would look like a mysterious blight. The data team would have terabytes of information showing a crop failure, but none of it would tell them the simple physical truth. They planted the wrong damn seed. I knew this with absolute certainty because I had run the trials myself 12 years ago. Mr. Abernathy, always looking for an edge, had been approached by the same commercial seed company. They offered him a great deal. I was skeptical, but he asked me to run a test plot. I planted 5 acres with their seed, right next to 5 acres of our heirloom. For the first month they looked identical. The salesman came out, took pictures, and beamed. I told Mr. Abernathy to wait. By week 6, the difference was stark. The commercial plot was yellowing, stunted. The heirloom plot was a vibrant, deep green. I wrote a 10-page report, complete with soil analysis, root mass comparisons, and yield projections. I filed it away. I'm sure it was still in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet in the main office, a paper ghost waiting to be discovered. They would find it, eventually, but by then, their fields would be a graveyard. They thought competence was expensive. They were about to learn the true cost of losing it. My quiet planning was interrupted by a phone call. A few days later, it was Maria Sanchez. Maria was my right hand, my senior field manager. I'd hired her 15 years ago, fresh out of agricultural college. She was smart, tough, and had an instinctive feel for the land that reminded me of my grandfather. She was family, in all but blood. Her voice was tight with anger. "Walter, you will not believe what is happening here," she said, her voice low, as if she were afraid of being overheard. "It's a circus." Julian held a 3-hour meeting this morning, a PowerPoint presentation full of buzzwords, synergizing our core competencies, actioning our growth verticals. He talked for an hour about the new drone fleet. These kids he brought in, they're walking around with tablets, looking at everything through a screen. One of them pointed to a perfectly healthy field and asked me if the pixel saturations indicated a potassium deficiency. I had to suppress a laugh. "What did you say, Maria?" I told him it was called the sun and the way it was hitting the leaves. He looked at me like I was a caveman. "Walter, they're preparing to plant. They're loading the silos with the commercial hybrid." I tried to tell Julian's new second-in-command, a kid named Chad, who looks like he's 12, that it was the wrong varietal for the South Fields. He just smiled, patted my shoulder, and told me, "The algorithm says it's optimal for this climate zone." He said it like he was correcting a child. The condescension, the arrogant dismissal of hard-won experience. It was a carbon copy of my own firing. I felt a surge of protectiveness for her, for all the good people still trapped in that unfolding disaster. "Maria," I said, my voice calm and even, "I need you to do something for me, and it's the hardest thing I'll ever ask of you." There was a pause. "Anything, Walter. You know that. Do your job," I said. "Follow every single one of their orders, perfectly, to the letter. Don't argue. Don't offer suggestions. If they tell you to plant seeds in a gravel pit, you ask them how deep. Be the best, most efficient employee they have.
and take notes. Every order, every meeting, every stupid decision. Write it all down. Be my eyes and ears. There was a long silence. I could hear her processing it. She was a problem solver. It went against every fiber of her being to stand by and watch a train wreck in slow motion. You have a plan, don't you? She finally said. Let's just say I'm diversifying my assets. I replied, using their own soulless language. Just trust me, Maria. When the time comes, you'll know what to do. She agreed. She would be my insider, my mole. Not out of a desire for revenge, but out of loyalty. Julian and his team thought loyalty was a currency you could buy with a paycheck. They didn't understand that true loyalty is earned, built over years of mutual respect and shared struggle. They had no idea how powerful that kind of loyalty could be.
The next call I made was to my lawyer, not the local guy who did our wills, but a specialist in agricultural intellectual property based out of the city. His name was Ben Carter, a sharp, unsentimental man who dealt in facts, not feelings. I explained the whole situation, my family's generations of work, the handshake agreement with Abernathy, the private seed bank, the firing, the commercial seeds they were about to plant. He listened patiently, only interrupting to ask clarifying questions. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Walter, this is a classic legacy mess," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Legally, it's murky. They could try to argue that since you developed the later generations of the seed while employed by them, that the seed is a work for hire and therefore a company asset. It's a common argument in software development, and they might try to apply it here." A knot of anxiety tightened in my gut. "Can they win?" "They can try," Ben said, "and it would be expensive for you to fight. However, you have several very strong cards to play. 1. The provenance. You can prove the foundational genetic stock predates your employment by decades. 2. The physical location. The seed bank is on your private, deeded property, not theirs. Possession is 9/10 of the law, as they say. 3. Their own actions. They fired you. They explicitly stated that your methods, your intuitions, were obsolete. It would be very hard for them to argue in court that you stole a priceless asset 1 week after telling you the week before that your entire contribution was worthless. An even halfway decent judge would see right through that hypocrisy. He paused, and I could hear him typing. "This is a debatable point, and some people might disagree, but in my opinion, your best move is strategic inaction. Don't contact them. Don't threaten them. Don't offer to sell them the seeds. Let them proceed. Let them plant the commercial seed. Let them fail. A potential lawsuit over intellectual property is abstract. A 50,000-acre crop failure is a concrete multi-million-dollar catastrophe that will get the attention of their investors in a way a legal letter never could. Let them make the first catastrophic mistake. We'll have them dead to rights." His advice was both terrifying and liberating. He was essentially telling me to let the farm, the land I loved, suffer a massive preventable wound. It felt like a betrayal of the land itself. But he was right. It was the only way to make them understand. The only language they spoke was money, and the only way to speak it was through catastrophic loss. So my plan was set. A plan of quiet observation. I would become a ghost, watching over my old life, waiting for the inevitable consequences of their arrogance to bloom. They had planted the seeds of their own destruction. Now, all I had to do was wait for the harvest. The days that followed were some of the strangest of my life. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, I wasn't waking up with the sun, my mind already in the fields, running through a mental checklist of irrigation schedules and pest reports. I was adrift. I spent time fixing things around the house that Eleanor had been asking me to do for years. I went fishing with my son Mark, who took a few days off from his city job to come see me. We sat on the edge of a lake, lines in the water, and for the first time, we didn't talk about the farm. We talked about his life, his work, his future. I felt a pang of guilt, realizing how much of my identity had been wrapped up in that place, how it had dominated every conversation, every thought. In a strange way, Julian had given me a gift I never would have given myself, a forced retirement. But the farm was never far from my mind. It was a phantom limb, an ache that was always there. My first move in this quiet war was the hardest. I did nothing, absolutely nothing. I didn't drive by the property. I didn't call any of my old contacts, other than my check-ins with Maria. I simply ceased to exist in their world. This, I knew, would be more unnerving to them than any angry phone call. I was a loose end they couldn't tie up, a ghost in their machine. They had erased me from the payroll, but they couldn't erase me from the history of the place. Maria kept me updated with short, cryptic texts. It was like listening to a battle report from a distant front. Their planting started in the North Quadrant. The new guys look like they're playing a video game on their tablets. Chad asked me why the soil pH was so high in Section 7, said the satellite data from last year showed it as neutral. I told him that's because you treated it with lime after the harvest. He just nodded like he understood. But his eyes were blank. They're not reading your logs, Walter. Planting finished. Julian brought out a case of champagne for his data team. They toasted to a new era of agricultural efficiency. I would read these texts and feel a grim, cold satisfaction. They were marching confidently into a minefield that I had mapped out years ago. They were so blinded by their own perceived brilliance, so high on the fumes of their buzzwords, that they couldn't see the cliff edge they were sprinting towards. Competence isn't just about knowing what to do. It's about knowing what you don't know. They didn't even know what questions to ask. A few weeks after planting, Maria's texts took a turn. We've got good germination. Drone flyovers show 95% emergence. Julian is strutting around like he's invented rain. He's already showing the initial growth charts to the Blackwood investors. I texted back a single sentence. Patience, Maria. The roots haven't hit the clay yet. A month passed. The spring rains were good. From the road the fields looked green and healthy. A casual observer would have seen a farm on its way to a banner year. But I knew what was happening beneath the surface. I knew that the young roots of the commercial hybrid were pushing down through the soft topsoil. But they were about to hit a wall. That dense, unforgiving layer of bentonite clay, a foot down, was waiting for them. Then the text I had been waiting for arrived. It came late on a Tuesday night. It's starting. I saw it myself today. The NDVI maps are showing yellow patches in Section 7 and 11. The data team is trying to recalibrate the drone sensors. They think it's an equipment malfunction. But I walked the field, Walter. It's not the drone. The plants are wilting at midday. The leaves have that pale, sickly look. It's happening. The panic hadn't started yet. Right now, it was just a puzzle, an anomaly in their perfect data stream. They would blame the equipment first, then the weather, then the fertilizer. They would look everywhere except the one place they should. The seed, because to admit the seed was wrong would be to admit that their entire philosophy was wrong. It would be to admit that the old man they dismissed as a relic actually knew more than their entire team of MBA-wielding tech gurus combined. And men like Julian don't admit they're wrong until the entire world is on fire around them. The public reveal of their incompetence came from an unexpected quarter. Julian, in a fit of hubris, invited a journalist from Modern Farmer magazine to do a feature story on their farm of the future. The journalist was a man named Frank Peterson, an old-school reporter with dirt under his fingernails who had known me and my father for years. He'd written about Abernathy Farms several times, always focusing on our sustainable practices and innovative land management. Maria told me Frank was coming. I knew him to be a sharp, observant man who couldn't be fooled by a PowerPoint presentation. This was my chance to land a subtle but devastating blow. I called Frank the day before his visit. I didn't badmouth Julian or the new owners. I simply said, "Frank, it's Walter. I hear you're visiting my old stomping grounds tomorrow. I'm not with them anymore, but I wish them the best. Do me a favor though, when you're out there, ask them specifically about the seed varietal they're using in the South Fields, and ask them how it's performing against the high bentonite content in the subsoil. I'd be curious to hear their answer." I hung up, knowing I had just armed him with a laser-guided question. Frank's article came out a week later. It was a masterpiece of journalistic assassination, all done with a polite smile. He praised the new technology, the shiny drones, the impressive data center. He quoted Julian extensively, letting his corporate jargon hang in the air for all to see. And then came the kill shot. Tucked into the middle of the article was this paragraph: "While the technology is undeniably impressive, questions remain about its application." During a tour of the southern acreage, this reporter noticed visible signs of chlorosis and midday wilting in several sections, classic indicators of root stress. When asked about the specific seed varietal chosen for this challenging soil type, Director Julian Thorne was unable to provide a specific answer, deferring to his data team, who assured us that their algorithms had selected the optimal genetic profile. However, they seemed unaware of the farm's historical struggles with the dense clay pan in this region, a problem the former agronomist, Walter Bishop, had famously solved with a proprietary, site-specific seed stock. He didn't need to say more. For anyone in the agricultural community, the message was crystal clear. The new guys were clueless. They were flying blind. The article didn't accuse them of anything. It simply laid out the facts and let the reader connect the dots. The seed of doubt had been planted, not in the soil, but in the minds of the entire industry. The panic at the farm, I suspected, was about to begin in earnest. The first crack in the dam appeared a week after Frank's article was published. It wasn't a loud explosion, but a quiet seismic shift. Maria called me, not on my cell, but from a payphone in a nearby town, a relic of a bygone era she used for sensitive conversations. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the undercurrent of emotion. "Walter, I'm done," she said. "I just gave my notice. I can't be a part of this anymore. It's not just a crop failure, it's a massacre. The wilting is spreading. The data team is in a full-blown panic. They're blaming a non-existent pathogen. Julian is screaming at everyone. It's toxic. It's a sinking ship, and I'm not going down with it." I felt a surge of pride and a pang of sadness. "Are you sure, Maria? You have a family to think about." "My family will be fine," she said firmly. "My reputation is more important. Anyone in this valley who knows anything about farming knows this isn't my fault, but I won't have my name attached to this disaster. And Walter, I'm not the only one." That was the real blow. "What do you mean?" I asked. "The other 5 senior field hands, the ones you trained, Miguel, David, the Johnson brothers, and Sam. We all talked. We're all walking. We handed in our resignations together, effective in 2 weeks. We're loyal to you, Walter, not to some suit from a city who thinks he can grow wheat with a spreadsheet." I was floored. This was the one thing I hadn't anticipated, a mass exodus of the only people left who had any real practical knowledge of how to operate the farm's equipment and manage its complex irrigation systems. Without them, even if Julian figured out the problem, he'd have no one with the skill to even attempt a mitigation strategy. The farm wasn't just losing its crop, it was losing its entire nervous system. They had fired the brain, and now the hands were walking away. It was a complete and total system collapse, triggered by one arrogant decision. Julian must have finally found my old report on the commercial seed trials.
Or maybe Frank's article had been the final clue, because a few days later, my phone rang. The caller ID said Abernathy Farms. I let it ring for a moment, savoring it, then answered with a calm, simple, "Hello, Walter. It's Julian Thorne." His voice was completely different. The smooth, condescending baritone was gone. In its place was a high, tight, strained tenor, the voice of a man dangling over a precipice by his fingernails. "I know who you are, Julian," I said. "What did you do?" He blurted out, the accusation raw and desperate. "You sabotaged us. You must have done something to the soil or the irrigation." I let him flounder. I didn't interrupt. When he finally ran out of steam, I replied, my voice as placid as a mill pond. "I did nothing, Julian. I went fishing. You, on the other hand, planted 50,000 acres with the wrong seed. I'm sure if you check your own team's data, they can pull the historical soil composition reports. It's all there. Or you could just find the test plot report I filed in 2012. It should be in the bottom drawer of the main office filing cabinet, under 6 for commercial hybrid failure." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I had just confirmed his worst nightmare.
He knew I was right. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of his ragged breathing. The power had shifted. It was no longer in his corner office. It was right here in my quiet living room. He finally spoke, his voice a pathetic squeak. Okay, look, we need your seeds, Walter. The heirloom stock. We have to try and replant some of the sections, salvage what we can. Name your price. We can work something out. Name your price." The words of a man who believes everything and everyone can be bought. He still didn't get it. "The seeds aren't for sale, Julian," I said quietly. "What do you mean they're not for sale?" He stammered. "Everything's for sale, Walter. We'll hire you back as a consultant, a senior consultant. We'll double your old salary, triple it. Just help us." The desperation was nauseating. The offer was insulting. He wasn't offering me respect. He was trying to buy my compliance. He saw me as a tool he could pick up again, now that he needed it. "Julian," I said, and I let a long pause hang in the air before I delivered the final blow. "A few weeks ago, you told me my intuition was an obsolete asset. You were wrong. My knowledge, my family's legacy, that's the most valuable asset your company ever had. And you threw it away for nothing. My price is that you can't afford me, and my consultancy schedule is now full. Goodbye." I hung up the phone. I didn't slam it down. I just gently placed the receiver back in its cradle. The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. The power shift wasn't just a change in leverage. It was a fundamental reordering of our realities. He was trapped in the disaster he had created, and I was free. The final act of the drama played out not in the fields, but through the mail. About a week after my call with Julian, a thick envelope arrived via courier. It was from the legal department of Blackwood Equity Partners. The letter was dense with legalese, but the message was simple. They were accusing me of theft, of intellectual property, and corporate sabotage. They claimed the heirloom seeds were a company asset and demanded I turn over my entire private stock immediately or face a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. It was a desperate, predictable gambit. They were trying to bully me, to scare me into submission. They were used to dealing with people who would fold under pressure. They weren't used to dealing with me. I didn't even call my lawyer. I just forwarded a copy of the letter to his office. 2 days later, Ben Carter, my lawyer, sent a response back to Blackwood's legal team. He told me later it was one of the shortest and most effective letters he had ever written. It contained only 2 attachments. The first was a certified copy of the deed to my family's land, the land where the seed bank was located, clearly showing it had been in my family's name since 1923. The second attachment
was an invoice. It was from me, addressed to Blackwood Equity Partners. It was a bill for 40 years of climate-controlled, secure storage for what they now claimed was their property. The total came to a little over $150,000, payable within 30 days. It was checkmate. Their legal threat was predicated on the idea that the seeds were their property. By sending me an invoice for storing their property, we had called their bluff in the most elegant way possible. If they wanted to claim ownership, they had to pay the storage bill. If they paid the bill, they were admitting they had abandoned their asset on my property for decades. If they didn't pay, their claim of ownership was demonstrably weak. They were trapped in a legal paradox of their own making. We never heard from their lawyers again. The news of the impending crop failure, which Julian had tried so desperately to contain, was now a runaway fire. Frank's article had been the spark, but the mass resignation of Maria and the other senior hands was the gasoline. Word travels fast in a farm, but the mass resignation of Maria and the other senior hands was the gasoline. Word travels fast in a farming community. Local suppliers, the fuel depots, the equipment repaid shops, the grain merchants who had extended Abernathy Farms credit for generations based on my family's reputation, started getting nervous. They began demanding cash on delivery. The farm's credit line, the lifeblood of any large-scale agricultural operation, was frozen by the regional bank. Blackwood Equity had bought a farm with a stellar reputation, but they had failed to understand that the reputation was attached to me. Not they had failed to understand that the reputation was attached to me, not the land. Without me, the name Abernathy Farms was just letters on a sign. The whole house of cards collapsed with shocking speed. Blackwood, being a private equity firm, had loaded the farm with debt to finance the purchase. The entire model was dependent on a successful first-year harvest to service that debt. With a 100% crop failure, they had no income, no credit, and a mountain of liabilities. It was a total unmitigated financial catastrophe. They had tried to streamline an operation they didn't understand, and in doing so had cut its throat. My vindication didn't come in a dramatic face-to-face confrontation. It came in a quiet phone call about a month later. It wasn't from Julian or anyone at Blackwood. It was from a man named George Peterson, the head of the Tri-Valley Farmers Cooperative, a coalition of about a dozen smaller family farmers. About a dozen smaller family farmers had been farming here as long as mine had been farming here as long his voice warm and respectful. We heard what happened, and frankly none of us are surprised. We've been watching those corporate vultures for years. He paused. We've also been struggling. It's hard for farms our size to compete on price with the big guys. We don't have the scale, but we've got something they don't. We've got deep roots in this community. I listened, unsure where he was going. Walter, we want to make you a proposition, continued. We don't want to buy your seeds. We want to license them. We want you like partner. You want to license them. We want you to be our partner. Your knowledge, your genetics, combined with our land and our hard work, we can build something better, something sustainable, something that values wisdom over spreadsheets. I was speechless. It values wisdom over spreadsheets. I was speechless. It was everything I thought I had lost. A chance to practice my craft, to work with people who respected the land, to continue my family's legacy, not as an employee, but as a partner. And Walter George added, we already have our first hires line. And Walter George added, we already have our first hires lined up if you'll have them. Maria Sanchez and her team are ready to start as soon as you say the word. And just like that, a new reality began. We formed a new company. We called it Heirloom Agronomy Company. We called it Heirloom Agronomy. I wasn't the chief agronomist anymore. I was a founder. My whole team, my agronomist staff. We weren't working on 50,000 acres. We were working on a dozen smaller farms, bringing the heirloom seeds back to the soil they were born from. Bringing the heirloom seeds back to the soil they were born from. Helping the heirloom seeds back to the soil they were born from. Helping families live. The ultimate vindication wasn't watching Julian fail, but building something better in the ashes of failure. The last I heard, Blackwood Equity had declared the farm bankrupt in the ashes of his failure. The last I heard, Blackwood Equity had declared the farm bankrupt and were trying to sell off the land in parcels. They learned a hard lesson. They thought they could buy a farm, but a farm isn't just land and equipment. A farm is a legacy. It's a body of knowledge. It's a relationship between people and the soil. It's something you earn. It's a relationship between people and the soil. It's something you earn, not something you acquire. A few months ago, I was walking a field with my father. He's in a wheelchair now, but I drive him out to one of the co-op farms whenever he feels up to it. The wheat was tall, the heads full and heads full and heads full. The wheat was tall, the heads full and head beautiful, uniform sea of gold. It was a field planted with the G3 Delta 7 strain rope, the one you had been so proud of all those years ago. He reached out a frail hand for a frail hand, stoic, faint smile, and reached those dirt wall that he said, and lead seed, legit seed. In that moment, looking out of the thriving crowd, surrounded by partners who valued our work, I felt a sense of peace that no corporate paycheck could ever buy. I had lost a job, but I had reclaimed my family's soul. Julian and his 10 boys, they saw the world as I had proclaimed my father's soul, reclaimed lives and outputs. They had all the information you could ever want, but they had absolutely no understanding. They truly believed they could replace a lifetime of accumulated wisdom with an algorithm that can digital listen with an algorithm, that they could digitize the soul of a place. They learned the hard way that you can't download a connection to the land. They learned that the most expensive thing in the world is a cheap solution. And they learned in the most painful way imaginable, the most painful way imaginable. And they learned the painful way imaginable. The confidence isn't cheap until you lose it. The real data, the data that matters isn't stored on a server. It's stored in a server. It's stored in the memory of the soil, in the heart of the soil, in the heart of the seed, and in the minds of the people who spent a lifetime learning to listen. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever poured your heart and soul into good job learning to be told you're just a line item or told you just a line item, love you to see it, leave this video right. Share it with someone who's reminded that real value isn't always something you can quantify. And I'd love to read your own stories in the comments below. What's the one piece of old school knowledge or infusion that your workplace simply couldn't survive without? Make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because there are a lot more stories to tell about what happens when arrogance meets quiet competence. Thank you for listening.